Dale Harter is a Rockingham County native. He is now the librarian at Albert Hill Middle School in Richmond. He began researching John T. Harris as an undergraduate at James Madison University and went on to edit Harris's memoirs for his master's thesis at the University of South Carolina. Along with his wife, Tracy, he established the archives for the Harrisonburg-Rockingham Historical Society. So if you come visit, you can see some of their work down in the archives. And he edited the Society's newsletter for many years. Wouldn't you like to return? He was also the Society's museum curator when it was located in Harrisonburg and then known as the Warren-Sipe Museum. So, I'm very excited to welcome him back. He has spoken for us before. It's always a treat when he comes because Margaret and he get to talk about their General Jones and lots of other genealogy stuff, and I get to ask questions about the Historical Society. So let's all learn something this evening and welcome Dale. Thank you.
Double mic?
You are double mic'd. We hope it will.
Oh, I guess my voice carries usually, so it should be okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. As I was revisiting this, I hadn't talked about the 1859 election in a lot of years. Actually, another topic I could have done for this election year was John T. Harris also supported the candidacy of Stephen Douglas for president against Abraham Lincoln in 1860, which is another great story. But as I was going back through things, and this is my master's thesis here, I still have a copy of. As I was going through things, I was looking back and checking some sources. I realized how much technology has changed in the last 30 years since I went to graduate school and started doing this research back in 1989. And you can tell here on the screen about the changes in technology. If you look very closely at this portrait of John T. Harris, you'll notice me taking the photograph of it. My head is right about where his collar is, and you can see my hands up. I had the fortune to go to visit a descendant of John T. Harris, Philip Peyton Randolph Harris, I think the fourth he was, in Andover, Massachusetts, to look at his original manuscript, and I was editing this. And so I took the portrait out in the backyard and took the picture like this. So since then, the other copies of this have been found. So, but I also want to thank tonight one of the guests tonight in our audience, Phil Stone, who many of y'all do not know, but his law firm, Wharton Allisheiser Weaver, is the descendant of the John T. Harris law firm of his son, John T. Harris Jr. So tonight we're going to talk about John T. Harris in the election of 1859. So how many exciting congressional elections do you remember? How many do you remember from 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 years ago? We often remember controversial presidential campaigns. Thank goodness we won't have one of those this year. But seldom do we remember the others. Well, tonight I'm going to tell you about an election that took place in 1859 in the Shenandoah Valley that was still being talked about more than 40 years later by old Democrats and former Whigs. Most of what I'm going to tell you will come straight from the pen and memory of a brash young lawyer from Rockingham County named John T. Harris, who upset the proverbial apple cart by ignoring the political conventions of the day, and I do mean conventions, to win a seat in the United States House of Representatives in 1859. Although his opponents never really recovered politically, he launched a career that would last 30 years. In 1898, he began writing his memoirs, which included his recollection of events during the campaign. Some of what I will tell you should sound familiar. It was a campaign based more on personalities than issues, and more on style than substance. And the person with the most style is the one who left the best stories. But before you hear from him, let me give you some background on a person some called Sly John, John T. and the Cool, Walk Along John, and a damn demagogue. John Thomas Harris was born May 8, 1823 at Browns Gap in Albemarle County to Nathan and Ann Anderson Harris. The family moved west across the Blue Ridge Mountains to the Shenandoah Valley and settled in Augusta County when Harris was about 5 years old. This is Nathan and Ann Harris, Ann Anderson Harris on the right. As John T. would mention in his memoirs, one of the reasons he got into politics was because of his mother. It was understood by many, in fact, I'll mention it tonight, that she was very well read on political issues of the day. And both her and her husband were Democrats of that they did not see the Constitution as a rope of sand that could not be broken, or the Union of the States could not be broken. And he carried these with him all his life. Although he never received a college education, he began teaching in Augusta County when he was 20 years old. He attended Judge Lucas Thompson's law school in Staunton, 1844 to 1845, and was admitted to the bar in 1845. He moved to Harrisonburg to begin his legal career, where he married Virginia Maupin Miller in 1854. They raised 7 children. 2 of them would become lawyers soon. Although no one could have known it at the time, Harris's decision to locate his practice in Harrisonburg and Rockingham County instead of Staunton and Augusta County had a major impact not only on his own career, but on the fortunes of numerous other individuals with political aspirations in the central Shenandoah Valley. Harris started making a reputation as a public speaker after moving to Harrisonburg and soon became involved in Democratic Party politics. He was a senatorial canvasser for Lewis Cass in 1848, a presidential elector for Franklin Pierce in 1852, and a presidential elector for James Buchanan during the 1856 campaign. And this is a copy of an electoral ticket. You'll see John T. Harris representing Rockingham County as an elector. His first attempt at elected office came at a time when the clamor for political change was sweeping the state. The Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1850-51 reportedly engaged the state's citizens as keenly as the national problems surrounding the Compromise of 1850. Not only did the new Constitution establish a fairer base of representation in the General Assembly and grant universal male suffrage, it also provided for the popular election of the governor and other state officers and reorganized the state judiciary system. Perhaps most importantly for Harris, the Constitution completely overhauled the structure of local government and made nearly every county office elected and accountable to the people through the ballot box. Before this, people were just selected by the people in office. And there was a politician that said they're like the wild hogs of the woods. They continue to perpetuate themselves. Before the 1851 Constitution, the overseers of the poor and school commissioners were the only elected officers in Virginia's county government. Harris took advantage of these changes by running successfully for Commonwealth's attorney of Rockingham County in 1852. He was reelected in 1856 and served in this position until 1859. His political connections soon led to appointments on the Board of Visitors at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington and the Virginia Institute for then called the Education of the Deaf, Dumb, and the Blind in Staunton. During this period, he also began to develop his skills as a courtroom lawyer and as a political debater and stump speaker for the Democratic Party. While serving as an elector for Buchanan in 1856, he crossed swords with John Minor Botts at a political meeting at Taylor Springs, now known as Massanutten Springs. And if you can imagine a political meeting at Taylor Springs, you see there, which is now Massanutten Springs, it's kind of amazing to think, but they spoke everywhere at that time. There weren't the big cities we know of today. Botts, a former member of the Virginia House of Delegates and a U.S. House of Representatives member, was serving as an elector for the American Party and their presidential nominee, Millard Fillmore. Harris said there were 6,000 to 8,000 people present that day, many of them Democratic. And when I thought about that today, I said, I wonder if I transcribed that wrong, and he said 600 to 800. But he said 6,000 to 8,000. It's amazing to me if it happened. But it was a presidential election, and back then, I guess you traveled where you had to travel. They went wild under my proofs, recalled Harris. I was thoroughly posted on congressional proceedings and newspaper politics. The crowd shouted, the drummer beat the drum, the bugler blew his horn, the boys climbed the tree and shook them in exultation, and when I concluded, the 6,000 or 8,000 rose and made all sorts of noises, and the ladies waved their handkerchiefs and rushed up to shake my hand. After the noise died down, Botts offered a retort. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the kind attention you have given to me, a political adversary. And I want to say to you, I commend your young elector to your kind attention. He will make a most useful and prominent citizen, and I prophesy for him a brilliant career. Then I felt good, and the crowd again cheered and huzzaed for Harris and Botts. But candor requires me to say, up to this time, he knows less than any man I ever knew who undertook to enlighten others. Then I fell flat, and all the Democrats pretty much the same. Ridicule from such a man as Botts was killing to a young fellow, and all my visions of glory from that discussion fled, and I drove home in a hurry. Despite this temporary setback, Harris was an ambitious young man and hungry for political office. So in late December 1858, he threw his hat in the ring as a Democratic candidate to replace John Letcher of Rockbridge as the Congressional House Representative for the 9th District. Letcher was going on to run for governor. He also claimed to be running to avenge his brother, Dr. Clement Rush Harris, a longtime Augusta County resident who had sought the Democratic nomination for lieutenant governor, but was defeated at the party convention in Petersburg when several prominent Democrats from Augusta and Rockbridge instead voted for Robert Latney Montague from Middlesex County and east of the Blue Ridge. Clement said these men voted against him because they wanted to run for the same congressional seat as John T. and knew that Clement could use his influence as the candidate for lieutenant governor to help elect his brother. The selection of Montague also highlighted the continuing political divide between Eastern and Western Virginia. Because Letcher was from the Valley, the men who opposed Clement's nomination said they did so to make sure both the East and the West were represented on the ticket. 4 men eventually joined Harris to battle for the 9th District seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. William Henry Harmon and James H. Skinner of Augusta, and Dr. Anderson Moffett Newman and Hiram Martz of Rockingham. Unfortunately, there's no pictures. I've not been able to find a picture yet of Skinner, and there's a reason for that. I'll tell you later, most likely. Did find a picture of William Henry Harmon and Hiram Martz. Have not found one of Anderson Moffett Newman, but there has to be one of those lurking around Harrisonburg. He was here for a long time. And this is Clement Rush Harris, John T. Harris's brother on the left. Born in 1828 in Waynesboro, Harmon was a lawyer and one of the vice presidents of the 1858 Democratic State Convention, the same one that denied the lieutenant governor nomination to Harris's brother Clement. He had served as a second lieutenant in the Augusta Volunteers during the Mexican War, but did not see combat. In 1851, he was appointed Commonwealth's attorney for the county and remained in this position for 10 years. In March 1859, while in the middle of the congressional race, he was appointed Brigadier General of the 5th Brigade of Virginia Militia by Governor Henry Wise. James H. Skinner was born in Norfolk in 1828, but moved to Staunton in 1844 and studied law under Judge Lucas Thompson, just like Harris did and just like Harmon did. He debuted as a political speaker in August 1848 when he represented the Democrats in a debate against 2 Whigs, Thomas J. Mickey and John D. Bowdoin. Ironically, he formed a law partnership with Mickey in 1849. Unlike Harris, he had some legislative experience at this time, having represented Augusta in the Virginia House of Delegates 1853 and 1854. Dr. Newman was born in Shenandoah County in 1810. He had practiced medicine in Augusta County and Pendleton County and was doing so in Harrisonburg in 1859. He had also read law and served a variety of local court and government positions in Rockingham County. He had represented Pendleton County in the Virginia House of Delegates and Page, Pendleton, and Rockingham counties together during the Constitutional Convention of 1850-51. Martz was the oldest candidate in the race, having been born in the Lacey Springs area in 1800. A farmer and a legislative veteran, he had represented Rockingham in the Virginia House of Delegates for most of the 1840s and 1850s. Despite his political experience, Martz was not much of a factor in the 1859 election. He is only briefly mentioned in Harris's memoir. In 1859, the 9th Congressional District consisted of 7 counties: Augusta, Bath, Hardy, Highland, Rockbridge, Rockingham, and Shenandoah. Beginning in January, the candidates would traverse the various counties, speaking in small towns, crossroads, and in the various county courthouses, mainly on court days, when a large crowd could always be had. And so here you can see outlined in red the counties at that time that made up the Congressional District. And basically, Rockbridge, Bath, Allegheny, and Augusta were kind of aligned together for the most part. Kind of more old Whigs there, a more established, more, I guess, genteel, more urban, except for Bath and Highland environment. And Rockingham, Pendleton, and Hardy and Shenandoah tended to group together more of a German population, different ethnic background. So the first day they met was at court day in January 1859 at the Augusta County Courthouse, which this was the building at the time. Parts of that are still there. It was incorporated in the new building when they redid it. And fortunately, due to George Caleb Bingham, an artist in the mid-19th century, he left some great pieces of paintings about political debates and court days at that time. So if you look at this picture, you can get a good example of what Harris and his opponents were doing at the same time. So the first meeting in January in Augusta. Our first meeting was at the January court, Augusta, recalled Harris. Big crowd present. Harmon and Skinner preceded me. No arrangement for rejoinders, just one speech apiece. Both made good speeches, but Harmon had to hold up his claims for military glory. He had been to the Mexican War, but on the northern line after Buena Vista and all the fighting was over, and all the Mexicans had gone to Veracruz to meet General Scott. He made some impression and claimed that over Skinner than me. My speech was impromptu. I began by saying, fellow citizens, I will make a clean breast and tell you how I felt and how I reasoned before announcing myself. I said to myself, there are 3 young men all about the same age. After disposing of Skinner, I turned to Harmon and said, William, you and I went to the same law school. We read out of the same books. You heard my lessons. I heard yours. We slept under the same roof. We ate at the same table. We were cited to the same judge. And then after we had finished, the same court that certified you, who, 21 and a man of good demeanor, so certified for me. The same judge that signed your license signed mine. I pitched my tent in the next county, County Rockingham, feeling satisfied no one county was big enough for two such men. In 1852, you were elected in your county's Commonwealth attorney, and I elected in mine. In 1856, you were reelected in yours and I in mine. So, Harmon, I thought honors were easy, and I thought chance or good looks or something might turn the scale in my favor, and I announced myself a candidate. Turning to the people, I said, but my fellow citizens, if I thought I was going to run up against an old military chieftain, I never would have shown my head. Laughter. I turned to him and said, Harmon, why did you not tell me about this? You used to sit by the hour and tell me of the happiest hours and days of your life you spent in Mexico. How you lived on the luxuries of the tropics, how you visited the Mexican girls. Don't blush so, I won't tell on you. And how that many charming dances you attended, and how the nobility, especially the girls, fancied American officers, and taken all together, you spent the happiest years of your life, and how my mouth watered for the good things the nobility were heaping on you, and how you mourned when the bugle blew, all aboard, and how you waved, farewell, farewell, if forever, still fare thee well. But I confess, fellow citizens, the gentleman's military career reminds me of an old Dutchman in Shenandoah, who during the War of 1812 took a 6-horse wagon loaded with bacon down to Norfolk to sell it. He was gone 6 months. In the meantime, he followed the life of a soldier and let his beard and hair grow. He wended his way home on foot, and his hair and beard had grown to immense length, and he looked frightful. Long hair was not worn then, you know. And as he approached his premises, the dogs took one look at him and, frightened, ran under the house. The chickens and animals of all descriptions fled, and his own little children ran in the house, frightened out of their wits at the looks of this worse than tramp. His wife alone stood at the threshold to contest the entry of this intruder. She stood firm, and he advanced until they got face to face. At length, the old man, overcome with the thought of everything running from him, and his wife not knowing him, burst into tears, threw his arms around his wife, and exclaimed, Sally, don't you know the old warrior yet? So I can imagine when the Virginia regiment was returning and the whistle blew for the Staunton company. The crowd shouted, the band played, guns were fired, and friends were looking for dear ones, and Colonel Mike Harmon was here looking for brother William. William stepped out again on Virginia soil, and his beard and hair had so grown his brother and friends did not know him. And observing this, William threw himself into his brother's arms and, bursting into tears, exclaimed, Michael, don't you know the old warrior yet? This pretty much broke up the meeting with good humor. The joke spread, and when we would speak at a distance, some fellow would hollow out to Harmon, there's the old military chieftain. Harmon never again referred to his military record, and when we would speak in other counties, some fellow would call out to tell that joke about the old warrior from Shenandoah. I would always turn it off pleasantly so as to leave no sting in Harmon. All the candidates were Democrats, and they agreed on most of the major issues of the day. The opposition party was a conglomeration of former Whigs, Americans, and know-nothings, and they did not even nominate a candidate to compete with the Democrats. Because there was no opposition candidate, the main issue during the canvass revolved around how the Democratic nominee would be selected, through a convention of party members or through a popular vote, which still happens today. When the candidates ran their first ads in the various district newspapers, they each stated what their position was on selection by convention. Skinner was the only candidate who actually stated his positions in print, as evidenced by this article from the January 11th, 1859 issue of the Staunton Spectator, the longtime Whig and later opposition paper. So Harris, this is the only, in all the newspapers I looked at, this is the only place where any of the candidates said, here's our platform as Democrats. All they did was mainly with ads on the side. From Harris's point of view, a convention was not necessary because the opposition party had shown no indication that they would field a candidate. Rather than have the Democratic Party in the district hold a convention and have selected delegates from each county vote for one candidate, Harris wanted to fight it out with the other candidates and let the voters decide at the election in May. While the campaign would become more and more heated as the months rolled by, early on, the candidates traveled to their debates together and even slept together in the same inns. So if you look at these ads on the left, so this is when they announced their candidacy, you will see at the end of each one, for Harmon, he says, subject to the decision of a district convention, in case the organization in case the organization of the Democrat Party requires it. Skinner said the decision of a convention if desired. Harris said subject to the decision of a convention if one be necessary. And then Newman said subject to the decision if one should be held. And this was a thing they would play on the whole campaign, especially Harris, because he said it's not necessary. So as I said early on, they traveled to their debates together. And one such adventure, they went to Monterey in Highland County. As Harris recalled, the next courthouse meeting was at Monterey. There all three met, including Dr. Newman from Harrisonburg, whom the wire pullers had induced to run to divide up Rockingham. We had a pleasant discussion to a full house and all hands satisfied. It must be borne in mind that there was no public issue between us, all Democrats and agreeing in the main. Next morning, we were to go to Hardy County, but when we got up, found the snow 18 inches and still a snowing. So we held a caucus and determined to come back to the valley and to our respective homes. Harmon was chaperoned by two lawyers and drove a spanking pair of horses in a fine carriage. Skinner and I on horseback. So in the deep snow and still snowing, we struck out. The carriage leading and breaking the way. We intended to dine at Shaw's Fork, where Stephen Reynolds had a small and comfortable private entertainment. And where Shaw's Fork was and where his private entertainment is in a town called Headwaters. And that's where the cow pasture and the bull pasture river, I believe, come together at Shaw's Fork. And if you see this from the 1860 census, this is Stephen J. Reynolds. He was an innkeeper. So it kind of verifies where he was. And this is the courthouse in Monterey. Skinner and I rode together, and on the way, I broke the subject of my running and told him, but made it personal, that I was running to punish him and Harmon for their treatment of my brother at Petersburg, and that I intended to beat them. I was sorry Dorman and Massey were not on the track, that I might kill all four at one shot. Dorman and Massey were from Rockbridge and had also opposed his brother's nomination. But Skinner and I jogged along until we got to the Bull Pasture River, a small stream, and as Skinner's horse put his head down to drink, his knee gave way, his foot on a rolling rock, and down came the horse to his knees and over his head. Skinner, saddlebags and all, came broadside in the river, but Skinner held onto the bridle, and it seems I can see him even now. After his horse had regained his feet, with his saddlebag lodged on a rock, and he holding the bridle and standing up in front of his horse and cursing him, he did not belong to the Young Men's Christian Association then. I begging him, Skinner, get on your horse, pick up your saddlebags, you will freeze. He heard me not. At length he gathered himself and his saddlebags up and mounted. I offered a blanket, but he refused. I then said, I will go ahead and have a good fire for you. And Gilpin-like I went off, but his horse kept up with me, and soon we landed at Reynolds. There we found the Harmon party had a roaring log fire and a big-bellied bottle of Applejack on the table. Hill, one of Harmon's escorts, was a curious fellow and a very much of a brag, called to Skinner, James, come and drink freely. Drink freely, James. You are in great danger. Then he called for Mrs. Reynolds thus, Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Skinner, a son of Commodore Skinner, is a candidate for Congress, and this morning he fell in the bull pasture and is wet all over. Can't you get him some of Stephen's clothes? She soon disappeared and reappeared with all Stephen's wedding outfit for 20 years of age. Stephen was 6'3" and Skinner was about 5'5". He stripped to the skirt and on went Stephen's pants. They had to turn them up at the bottom as high as Skinner's knees. Then came the vest and coat and the old blue broadcloth coat with plain brass buttons and collar up to the top of his head. He presented a unique picture. Every few moments, Hill would bring up the bottle and say, James, drink freely. You must drink or it may be the death of you. Harris and Harmon here don't care what becomes of you, but I want you to get all right and drink. And he drank until his nose was red and he was pretty merry. His clothes were dozing by a big fire. At length, dinner of venison and such was ready, and we ate and drank some too. Skinner did not do all the drinking, and he did not have the only red nose. About 3 o'clock, we put on his dry clothes, and all hands struck out for the Hill's home at the east foot of Shenandoah Mountain. We arrived there safely, and soon his servants had a rousing fire in the parlor, and he sent for Mrs. Hill. I must give his introduction of us to Mrs. Hill. In she came. He arose. Mrs. Hill, you are now in the most august and distinguished presence it has ever fallen to your lot. I present to you Mr. Skinner, a son of Commodore Skinner of the U.S. Navy, a distinguished graduate of the University of Virginia, and a rising and already risen lawyer of Staunton. And now let me present to you Captain W.H. Harmon, a soldier of the Mexican War, a distinguished member of the Staunton Bar, and Commonwealth's attorney for Augusta County. And now, madam, last but not least, my distinguished young friend, John T. Harris of Rockingham, a son of Nathan Harris, the first cousin of William H. Crawford of Georgia, and the Commonwealth's attorney for his county. whose mother is the brightest and best informed woman on public questions I ever knew of in Virginia. Now, Mary, do not feel embarrassed in this presence. You will never get such witness again. Now, Mary, we want a good supper. Can you give us some strong coffee, old Java? Yes, sir. Can you give us some ham and eggs? Yes, sir. She bowed out gracefully, and soon we had a glorious supper, and Skinner had kept his bottle, which we bought from Monterey, and we took a little of that. At the proper time, we retired, Harmon and Skinner in one bed, I in another, both in the same room. We took breakfast and separated, they going to Staunton and I home. Afterwards, Hill told me his wife asked him who slept in each bed, and Hill told her, and she said, I'm for Harris. Could hardly see anyone that slept in his bed. He spread the cover back and put the pillows in place, and the other bed looked like pigs had slept on it. I had lived a bachelor long enough to learn to adjust my cover a little on getting up. Thus ended the Highland trip. You can imagine these guys, it's the dead of winter, and these guys are traveling by horseback across the mountains into Pendleton County. They'd go to Hardy County. They'd go to Rockbridge, everywhere to debate. Although Harris did his best to convince the people and political powers in the various counties that a convention was not needed to select a Democratic candidate for Congress, a convention would be held on March 30th at the Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg. The delegates who had attended had been elected or selected at meetings in their respective counties. As Harris had expected, only Harmon and Skinner received nominations, and the only arguments made by their supporters concerned which one would be better suited to take on Harris if he chose to run an independent campaign. The convention chose Skinner as the Democratic Party's nominee, and Harris chose to go it alone. I stopped at an ABC store to find some. They do sell some, but I could not find any, so I had to come along. Sure. Thank you. Thank you, sister. You have to come, sir. Thank you, Reverend. As you should see by now, elections and politics have not changed that much since 1859. And like today, the media likes to get involved and shudder the thought to support one candidate over another. From January to the actual election in May, 4 Valley newspapers devoted a good deal of their weekly coverage to the congressional campaign. The Rockingham Register and Valley Democrat in Harrisonburg, and the Spectator and Vindicator in Staunton. The Vindicator, edited by Henry Mickey and James Crank, was a Democratic newspaper and supported the convention candidate Skinner, as did the Rockingham Register, a Democratic newspaper edited by John Wortman. Wortman and Harris were friends, but Wortman was going to support the convention candidate. The Valley Democrat and the editor Samuel T. Walker was the only newspaper to support Harris from start to finish. The editors of the Spectator, which was a longtime Whig and opposition party newspaper, had the most fun during the campaign as they poked and prodded all the Democratic candidates with gusto. A few days after the convention selected Skinner, the Spectator published an article that made fun of the long-standing rivalry and animosity between Augusta County on one hand and Rockingham and Shenandoah counties on the other. It also warned Skinner what he could expect from Harris. So I'm going to read from the Staunton Spectator. And it's most likely was written by Joseph Waddell, and he was an author, wrote a book called The Annals of Augusta County. And well, I'm sure he wrote this article. It was called Augusta Triumphant, written after the convention selected Skinner. We will deny that we are prophets after the very signal fulfillment of our prediction made when the question of a convention was first mooted, that if one was held, Rockingham and Shenandoah, with all their force of numbers, would be compelled to succumb to the superior scientific skill of old Augusta. Just so it has turned out. Whenever voting is to be done, the democracy looked to Rockingham and Shenandoah imploringly, nor have they ever looked in vain. But whenever it comes to the distribution of honors, pshaw, get out of the way, Swabians, and make room for the elite. For heavy draught, we don't pretend to compete with you, but the Dutchman's horse don't lift his feet fast enough for the race course. The convention met in Harrisonburg on the 30th ultimate, and a great many people went down expecting to see a huge amount of fun. They were sadly disappointed. The convention was the tamest thing imaginable. Not a single drop of blood was shed, and nobody was seriously hurt, save Captain March and General Harmon. Dr. Newman was slightly injured, but not to such an extent as to prevent the exercise of his professional skill upon his unfortunate companions in misfortune. Skinner walked right over the track, bounding lightly over the shoulders of the general, skipping gracefully over the half-reclining captain, and stepping gently over the already prostrate form of the tired disciple, and I think I'm going to get this right, of Esculapius, which is a Roman term for medicine, god of medicine and healing. The race is huzzah for the gallant democracy of old Augusta. When they go a-cattin', they go a-cattin'. The race is now made up. Go it, Skinner. Go it, Harris. We stake our money on the bobtailed nag. Will nobody bet on the bay? Our friend Skinner has a pretty considerable job before him. If he comes in ahead of John Harris, he must strip himself to the waist and cut his hair as short as John Letcher's. Otherwise, he will never be able to follow his competitor through the laurel thickets and bramble bushes, through which he will glide like a gazelle. Harris will be fondling the children in Brock's Gap today and visiting the sovereign of House Mountain tomorrow. When he gets into a crowd of people, he pushes through at an angle of 45 degrees, grasping one man with his right hand and another with his left hand, repeating with as much volubility as the razor strop man. Hi, I'm John T. Harris, candidate for Congress. How's your family? However, if Harris will please the old folks and the children, Skinner will take the eye of the maidens. It is our opinion that he could not handle a baby as gracefully as his experienced competitor, but with the fair sex, he will prove irresistible. As this is a family quarrel among the democracy, it would not become us to interfere and spoil the sport. All we ask is that they may do the thing up handsomely. Mr. Skinner, our personal friend, a high-toned, chivalrous gentleman of more than ordinary talent, and he will make a creditable representative. Mr. Harris has been endorsed by his party in various ways, and in 1856 was the presidential elector for this congressional district. He insists the people will endorse him again, and avers that the action of the convention was by no means a fair expression of the voice of the people. He claims to be backed by a majority of the voters of Shenandoah and Rockingham, notwithstanding the entire vote of the former, and a majority of the latter were cast into the convention for Mr. Skinner. We cannot perceive that the democracy have effected any good by holding the convention. They still have the fight between two of their own men, and the war will be waged with tenfold acrimony. The only thing achieved by the operation is the political death of some of the most efficient and prominent men in the ranks. Marx is dead, Newman is deader, and Harmon is emphatically no more. Peace to their ashes. If Skinner is elected, he is in for life. If Harris is triumphant, Skinner too will be consigned to the tomb of the Capulets. The Harrisonburg Convention will be remembered as the great car of juggernaut under whose ponderous wheels several of the shining lights of democracy have been crushed, sacrificial victims to the tyranny of party discipline. They don't write them like that anymore, do they? So they were making great fun of this. The Spectator thought this was great because they thought they were seeing the Democratic Party in the Shenandoah Valley disintegrate, but that wouldn't be the case. As the debate in Hardy County will show, the Spectator was right on the money about the battle to come. By and by, we met at Hardy Court, a packed house. Here I had made some reputation by defending a young man for stealing $102 from a very unpopular man. Most people were glad he lost the money, and my client was a very popular young man. Hardy County had many wealthy and intelligent men. The temperance feeling was running high, and the county was strongly temperance and Presbyterian. I knew the local feelings and prejudices. Skinner knew nobody. If you know anything about Hardy County, it sure has changed over the last 100 years. I don't think temperance is a thing there anymore. But I found this nice picture of the Presbyterian church choir in 1871 in Moorfield, so I thought that made me a nice touch here. And I knew the local feelings and prejudice. Skinner knew nobody. Skinner always had a little pitcher of toddy put on the stand by him, which he sipped during the discussion. Whilst I was speaking, I picked up his pitcher by mistake and pretended to drink from it. I jerked it from my mouth and blew like a porpoise and hollered out, "Water, Sheriff, water, I'm burning up." Water was handed and I drank freely. Then a pause and in a low tone, but a loud whisper so that everybody heard me. I said, "Skinner, I ask your pardon. I thought it was water." Then such roars of laughter I seldom heard, partly at my expense that I was so badly fooled and burnt by the whiskey, and then that Skinner was exposed. The incident fixed him and Hardy, and I beat him there over 2-1. It spread all over the district, and when Skinner got home to Staunton, someone asked him, "Skinner, is it true that Harris and Hardy drank your whiskey and then pretended it burned him so badly he had to call for water?" Skinner said yes, and the damn demagogue had more in his belly than I had in my pitcher. As the candidates entered the home stretch, they sparred in both courthouses in that tiny crossroads. Harris recalled there were numerous meetings at the side towns, and there was not a village in the district scarcely in which there was not a tall pole for Harris or Skinner, and in many 2 poles, one for each, with large flags floating in the breeze. And on occasion, allies appeared out of nowhere to try and turn the tide for their respective candidate. And it's interesting, the debate I'm going to tell you about here took place at Conrad's store, we know at Elkton, and this very evening, Tony Wilt is having a meeting over there for the Republican Party. So I think it's very interesting. They still go to Conrad's store in Elkton to politic. From the Harrisonburg discussion, we branched out. The next place was at Kites at the foot of the Blue Ridge on the Rockingham County Turnpike to Gordonsville. And I believe Kites was the home of Hiram Kite. I was looking at several places where this could have done. There's a Kite store, but it's actually in Page County. And Hiram Kite was a very prominent man, so it could have been held at his house outside of Conrad's store. Here we had a large crowd, and apple brandy seemed to flow from every rock, but nobody drunk, but all felt it a little. We spoke in the open air from a stand erected for us. Skinner had the conclusion and made good speeches and cheered up his friends some, but was a little taken down by an incident I will relate. There was a leading man in the neighborhood called Big George Miller, a merchant at Conrad's store. During all the discussion, his voice could be heard above everybody else, especially when I was speaking, saying, "Hurrah for Skinner! I bet he will be elected." Until at length, Turner Shiflett from up in the mountain, a very respectable man of good sense and fine size, got up and said, "George Miller, here is $500, shaking it in his hand. I'll bet on Harris. Now come and cover it. Come and cover it. Come and cover it. If you do, you can holler for Skinner as much as you please. If you don't, and hollow again, stretching out his long arm with a clenched fist, I will break your damn big jaw." Great applause. Miller never covered it and slunk off, never again saying hurrah for Skinner. This did me more good than a dozen speeches could, for there was jealousy between the mountain voters in a large majority and the river from which Miller was. The result at Conrad's store was no longer, if at any time, in doubt. Shiflett was a man of fair means and a king bee in the mountains, and much respected by everybody. He is yet alive. If it come in the way for one of my boys to do him or his children a service, I hope they will, for his friendship was genuine and his action of his own thinking. We used not a dollar in those days, and Miller knew, and everybody knew, he meant just what he said. Hence, Miller respected the admonition and kept silent, but was so much the subject of taunt that he left Kites in disgust before the meeting adjourned. And as the crowd was wending their way home, you could hear clear and distinct sounds from the mountain roads. "Hurrah for Harris!" Answered back from another road, "Hurrah for Harris!" Shiflett was at the place of voting. Miller came out of his store only long enough to vote and was never heard to holler, "Hurrah for Skinner" again. It took a few days to accurately tally the votes from the election on May 26, but in the end, Harris defeated Skinner to become the representative of the 9th Congressional District. As expected, Skinner bested Harris in Augusta, Rockbridge, Bath, and Highland, but could not overcome the combined might of Rockingham, Shenandoah, Pendleton, and Hardy counties. Although the bickering would continue within the Democratic Party for some time, the Staunton Vindicator issued a call for peace and unity. "Mr. Harris is now the member-elect from our district," wrote their editors on June 17th. "Let the democracy give him a fair and impartial trial. Our opposition was not to the man so much as to the independent candidate, but now he is the representative, and let him be treated as such. He is a rising man, and no doubt will exert himself to meet fully the responsibility of the station to which he's been elected." And these are the results in the paper. So Harris's majority was about 800 votes in Rockingham. And the reason I show the paper, the image above, this was from the James Taylor sketchbook, Union officer during 1864. And this is North Main Street in Harrisonburg. And this is the Presbyterian church where they met to count or do the convention votes to select a candidate. And Harris was actually living in the house right next to it at the time. And something I was not going to include, but I found it today. I thought I would say this. When the convention was meeting, this is when they were tallying to select delegates. He said, "I had become weary of the crowd and went to my house for rest. I retired to my back porch. There was no building between the church and my house. My little daughter, Anna, was sitting on my lap, begging me to take her to the church to hear the music, a brass band. I tried to reconcile her. At length, it occurred to me to say, 'Anna, we must not go there. Those old men don't want your papa to go to Congress.' And of course, she did not know what Congress was, but she caught the idea they were no friends of mine. She turned upon my knee and putting one hand on each cheek said, as only a child can say it, 'Fairy, I shall say you shall go to Congress,' the big tears standing in her eyes and kissing me at the same time. I told this incident in my next speech at Harrisonburg, and Colonel Gray, a friend of Skinner, but a kind, sympathetic man, wept, and he told me after he could not restrain himself." And now for the rest and last of the story. John T. Harris ended up serving in the House from December 1859 to March 1861, where he was conspicuous as an ardent advocate for union. He did not want Virginia to secede, did not want the South to secede. He also continued his independent ways by repeatedly disregarding party boundaries to work with members of the opposition party. Judging by existing letters from various correspondents between January and March 1861, most of Harrison's constituents supported his actions in Congress as the nation moved ever closer to civil war. This picture of Harris by Brady was probably taken after the Civil War, right at the beginning of the Civil War. Like most other Virginians, Harris could not abide by Abraham Lincoln's call on April 15, 1861, for volunteers to put down the rebellion, and in May, he publicly aired his review of the rapidly unfolding events. If we would have peace, Harris wrote, we must show to the North that we are united against their war of aggression and subjugation, that on this question there are no Union men, no secessionists, but all united with one heart and one hand in defense of Virginia, her soil and her honor. Like many other elected officials, Harris shed no blood in the ensuing conflict. In 1863, Rockingham citizens elected him to the Virginia House of Delegates, where he served until the war's end. In the months following Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Harris used his influence as a former congressman to have Confederate prisoners of war released from northern prisons. After the Civil War, Harris served 3 years as judge of the 12th Judicial Circuit Court, hearing many cases that posed novel legal questions growing out of the war. Only one of Harris's decisions reportedly was overturned by the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals. Though defeated in his first bid for re-election in 1869, he came roaring back in 1870 to win the House seat for the new 6th Congressional District. He also incurred the wrath of many old political foes when he was selected as the Conservative Party's candidate for Congress at a convention held in Harrisonburg. He didn't mind at that time. He served in Congress continuously from 1871 to 1881, defeating new candidates during each election and representing an ever-shifting district. Harris defeated his foes by comfortable margins in his re-election bids and was not seriously challenged until he met fellow Democrat and Rockingham resident John Paul in 1878. Although Harris won the election, Paul beat him nearly 2-1 in Rockingham County. Citing health reasons and perhaps seeing the writing on the wall that Paul could beat him, he declined a unanimous renomination of the Democratic Party in 1880. Sure enough, Paul defeated Shenandoah County resident Henry C. Allen in the ensuing election and assumed Harris's seat. Harris returned to his law practice in Harrisonburg, where he was joined for a time by his sons, Graham and John T. Jr. Although based in Virginia, he devoted much of his practice to contested election cases in other states. He also continued to take an active part in Virginia politics and was a frequent delegate to state and national Democratic conventions. In 1889, Harris cast the political die one last time as an unsuccessful opponent of Philip W. McKinney for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination. McKinney went on to win the governorship and appointed Harris as one of the state's commissioners to the World's Fair in 1893. Harris died at his home in Harrisonburg on October 14, 1899. In his obituary, the editor of the Rockingham Register paid homage to the attributes that had helped earn him his victory in 1859. He was a born diplomat in handling men and measures, while as a debater on the hustings in the arena of rough and tumble discussion, which was so prominent a feature of the politics of those days, he was almost without peer. While in Congress, he knew intimately thousands of his constituents and rarely misplaced a face or miscalled a name. This faculty, together with a shrewd knowledge of human nature and an almost boundless fund of humor and anecdote, gave him a hold upon the people which many of his ablest and most popular opponents failed time after time to break. His funeral was noted as one of the largest held in Harrisonburg and was attended by all classes of people. So I'll finish by telling you what happened to his opponents. And I don't have any pictures of them, but I can tell you what became of them from these images. 2 years after the election, this is the image on the left, in May 1861, William Henry Harmon was appointed lieutenant colonel of the 5th Virginia Infantry Regiment, which contained 8 companies from Augusta County. He attained the rank of colonel and served on Confederate General Edward Allegheny Johnson's staff. He was killed March 2nd, 1865, near his boyhood home at the Battle of Waynesboro, the only recorded Confederate casualty in one of the last engagements of the war. He is buried in Stanton's Thorn Rose Cemetery. Last night I was looking for a good image of this monument, and I couldn't find it, and then I found a recent article about 2 years ago from the News Virginian in Waynesboro, and I couldn't read it unless I got a subscription. So I said, well, $1 for 6 months, I'll do that. And I was astounded, but his monument was vandalized and removed in 2021. So I'm sure that will surprise everybody. So like Harmon, James H. Skinner cast his lot with the Confederate Army. He served in the 52nd Virginia Infantry Regiment, which also was made up mainly of Augusta County soldiers, rising in rank from captain to colonel. He was wounded 3 times, the last one occurring on May 12th at the Battle of May 12, 1864, at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, when he was shot through the eye. And I think this is why you don't see any, he was pretty horribly maimed in the war. I don't think you see a picture of him because of that reason. While his wounds prevented him from actively practicing law after the war, he did serve another term in the Virginia House of Delegates in the 1880s. As president of the Augusta Memorial Association, he was instrumental in creating the Confederate Soldiers section in Thorn Rose Cemetery, and that was a big deal. That's Skinner was well remembered for that, for doing this for the people of Stanton. He died in Stanton on May 19th, 1998, and was buried near his father in Norfolk's Cedar Grove Cemetery. Dr. Anderson Moffett Newman lived the rest of his life in Harrisonburg, and y'all maybe will recognize this house. This is the Elks Lodge today. He practiced law and served as commissioner of a chancery in the Rockingham County Circuit Court. He also accumulated a vast portion of land on the east side of South Main Street, much of which today is James Madison University. He died March 29, 1900, and was buried in Woodbine Cemetery. This house has some really great stories. Margaret and I can tell you a few about that. So it goes by many names. It's been by the Newman House, the Isaac Paul House, the Lurdy Alexander House. So finally, Hiram March died on October 19th, 1861, at his home on Smith's Creek. And his main claim to fame was really his son, D.H. Lee March, who was the clerk of the county court for 30, 40 years. His obituary in the Stanton Spectator lauded him as a gentleman of high character and fine intelligence. He maintained always the character of an honest, upright man. How he became a politician, we'll never know. Paying the most scrupulous regard to the discharge of every just obligation. He is buried in the March Family Cemetery in 10th Legion. So there you have it, the congressional election of 1859. Any questions? Oh, well, let me see. I'll explain this. So, John, no, this house stood where Asbury, well, basically where Asbury United Methodist Church is. It's set directly beside the Warren-Sipe house. I believe it may have been built by the same contractor, I think. But it was right there. And one of the memories of Judge John T. Harris late in life was he had a huge garden, and they would often see him out tending his garden. That was a memory a lot of Harrisonburg citizens had at that time. So that like many buildings in Harrisonburg, that was torn down, I think, basically for an area for the church there. I don't know exactly, but there was a team of people at JMU back in the Madison College back in the 30s and 40s. Remember there being a tea room in the basement there too. So it was kind of neat. Yes, sir.
This election was held in May and not another year. When did that change?
But I don't know that answer to that question. I know that, yeah, because he didn't take office until December of that year. But the election would always end in the term would end in March. The election was held in May. So I don't know. Presidential election was still held in the fall. Yes. So the question was, when did the congressional election change from being held
Late spring versus previous fall?
Late spring is opposed to the previous fall. So good question. Can anybody answer that? I don't know. Good question. Yes, I've wondered about a lot of times that you do this and you start thinking, wait a second, the election was held because you think in current terms, and then you're trying to juggle with how they did it back then. I always had to look at it because the convention to nominate people happened in December of 1858, and then the delegates, the candidates all competed through the spring. So, but that was very odd to me too. So sometimes when I would say the election of 1858, I mean, no, the election of 1859. So I don't know. I don't know.
Asbury is. So you can barely see the Foot Museum building between the tree and the Harrison House there. And if you look at the painting by Emily and Brian, you can see the back of the two houses. So they're like twins. They're carrying around.
And as an aside, I'll tell you a little bit about, so of all of his children, of his of his two sons, John T. Harris Jr. practiced law in Harrisonburg all his life and died here. And if any of y'all remember Dr. Gene Wine, John T. Harris Jr.'s house was where the World War I memorial is, where Liberty and South Main come together. And that's where John T. Harris had a very Gothic looking house. And Dr. Wine, I'll never forget telling me that Peyton Randolph Harris IV, or John T. Harris's grandson, was out playing one day. And John T. Harris Jr.'s wife was very elegant and very precise. And she remembered he was playing across the street and he got into a fight. And she ran out and said, "Desist, Peyton. I say desist." So that was kind of interesting. But his other son, I think, was more colorful. His other son was a lawyer for a time in Harrisonburg, Graham Harris, and he ended up going to Chicago and living in Chicago. Was commissioner of the Board of Education. There is some family lore that he had something to do as an attorney with getting rid of Al Capone. I don't know if the dates match up with that. I've never seen any proof of that. But he also had a home. It's called Seven Oaks. He married a brother-in-law of Lady Astor, and he owned Seven Oaks over in the Greenwood section of Albemarle County, and that home's still standing there too. He was a great fly fisherman, supposed to be one of the best in the state of Virginia and in the country. And a couple of weeks ago, I was Googling his name, and a couple of years ago, a really pristine tackle box full of handmade flies was sold at an auction, and it said, and it was stenciled Graham H. Harris on it. So I thought that was kind of cool. So. Yep. And he had one daughter, I think, that was a professor at Madison College for many years too. So it was still in his college.
You know, what's become of Harris literature?
I don't know. I don't know. Dr. Stone asked if I knew what had become the Harris heirs, and I came to know them through Mr. Stone. I went to visit Peyton Randolph Harris IV in Massachusetts when he still had the memoir in his possession. And they're very gracious people. And I lost contact with him in correspondence probably back in the early 2000s. I think he passed away, but I'm assuming the things. So, what didn't come to you? I mean, many things came to the Historical Society. For people in the audience and people out here, the John T. Harris papers are owned by the Historical Society, but they're kept at JMU. I had them microfilmed by the State Library, so you can access them on microfilm in Richmond, or you can see the originals here. He donated scrapbooks over the years, things they've added to the collections like that too. So just a great massive information. And the man had told me one time when the Harris house was abandoned or going to go for sale, that they were starting to throw this, they had shovels in the attic and were throwing this stuff out into a truck, and somebody stopped them and realized that was the Harris papers. That's the story. It may be apocryphal, but no, I don't know what happened to the ancestors. I'd like to catch up with them again. So he sent me the picture of the house and gave it to me. I asked him, I said, "Do you want this to go to collection?" He said, "No, that's for you." So that was nice of him too. So. But there are plenty of them around. He had another son, William Anderson Harris, who founded Virginia Seminary in Staunton. He founded a college, Virginia College in Roanoke, and all of his family married well. They married into railroads and all this stuff, and they were quite a lot of colorful characters in the family.
So thank you so much. I'm sure Dale will be happy to chat, but we'll sign off on the webinar.